It was meant to be the happiest day of their lives, a celebration of love, unity, and the promise of forever. Pastor John Mitchell and Judge Maria Johnson had just exchanged vows, their smiles frozen in time as they stood before friends and family, seemingly destined for greatness. But beneath the polished perfection of their union, something was already cracking. No one could have known that, within hours, their wedding night would spiral into horror. By the early hours of the morning, one of them would be dead, and the other, a man who had spent his life preaching redemption and grace, would stand accused of an unspeakable crime. What led to that moment? Had something sinister been festering beneath the surface long before their vows were spoken? Or was it the events of that night that shattered everything, sending a man of faith hurtling toward murder? The answers lay buried under layers of hidden resentment, suppressed fears, and the weight of unspoken truths. A marriage that began with whispered promises and tender embraces would end in blood and silence. What unfolded behind closed doors on that fateful night would not be remembered as the start of a new chapter, but as the birth of a nightmare, one that no one saw coming. Pastor John Mitchell was a man who commanded respect with his mere presence. Tall, charismatic, with a voice that could soothe or ignite passion, he had spent years leading his congregation through times of doubt and despair. To his followers, he was a symbol of unwavering faith and moral authority. But faith can be a fragile thing, and John was not immune to the darkness that lurked within the human soul. For all his grace, there was something in him, something restless, something simmering beneath the surface. A past he never spoke of, a burden he carried in silence. Maria Johnson, by contrast, was a force of nature. In the courtroom, she was relentless, a judge whose sharp mind and unshakable resolve had made her both admired and feared. She fought for justice, held power in her hands, and never let emotion cloud her judgment. But behind the black robes and the stern facade, Maria was still human, and even the strongest minds have their breaking points. Together, John and Maria appeared flawless, a couple who had it all: success, prestige, a love story that should have been legendary. But on the night of their wedding, something snapped. And once the silence was broken, there was no going back. They were opposites in many ways, her commanding presence clashing against his quiet restraint. To the world, their differences balanced each other, a perfect harmony of power and poise. Together, they embodied success, admiration, and the illusion of an unshakable bond. But illusions are fragile, and behind the carefully curated image of perfection, fractures had already begun to form. No one suspected the truth. No one saw the strain beneath their smiles or the weight of the unspoken resentments that simmered between them. Their wedding day had been flawless, an extravagant display of love and unity, witnessed by family, friends, and admirers who saw only the fairy tale. The ceremony was breathtaking, every detail meticulously arranged. Laughter and champagne flowed, the music soared, and for a brief moment, they played their roles to perfection. But perfection is a delicate thing. As the night drew to a close, the newlyweds withdrew to their hotel suite, the echoes of celebration fading behind them. The soft click of the door was meant to mark the beginning of a new life together. Instead, it sealed them inside with the inevitable reckoning they had both been avoiding. The room, adorned with the remnants of their grand day, flowers, untouched champagne, the lingering scent of perfume, felt suffocating. The weight of expectation, of unspoken frustrations, pressed down on them. At first, there was silence, a silence thick enough to choke on. Then came the words, sharp, edged with something that had been left unsaid for too long. A comment, a glance, a shift in tone, Beshon, and just like that, the tension that had festered beneath the surface for months erupted. What should have been a night of intimacy and celebration turned into something else entirely. The walls that had borne witness to laughter just hours before but now absorbed something darker: anger, betrayal, the sound of something breaking. No one outside that room could have predicted what was coming. No one dancing in the reception hall, raising glasses in their honor, could have imagined that by morning, their wedding wouldn't be remembered as a beginning, but as the night everything ended. The storm of the wedding had passed, leaving only the quiet aftermath. The guests had gone home, the music had faded, And now, at last, they were alone. Their wedding night, the night that was supposed to mark the beginning of forever. John poured 2 glasses of champagne, the bubbles rising and disappearing in a slow, delicate fizz. He handed one to Maria, their fingers brushing briefly. She smiled, soft and radiant, as their glasses clinked together. For a moment, everything felt as it should. The conversation was light, their voices filled with the lingering warmth of the celebration. They spoke of the wedding, the future, the life they were about to build together. But beneath that surface, beneath the laughter, the champagne, the easy rhythm of their words, something was shifting. At first, it was nothing, a slight change in the air, subtle and almost imperceptible. But as the minutes passed, it became harder to ignore. A scent. It crept into John's awareness slowly, unwelcome and persistent. It wasn't the floral perfume Maria had worn that day, nor the lingering fragrance of candles or champagne. It was something else, something wrong. He tried to dismiss it, brushing it off as exhaustion or the weight of the long day pressing down on him. But the longer he sat there, the more it gnawed at him. The smell thickened, settling in the back of his throat like something rotten, something out of place. It shouldn't be there. It couldn't be there. John looked at Maria, the woman he had just married, the woman who had stood before him hours ago, flawless in her white gown, vowing herself to him. And yet, sitting across from her now, something was different. The way she moved, the way she breathed. It was all the same, but not quite the same. The irritation started as a whisper at the edges of his mind. A small, nagging thing, but it didn't stay small. It grew, twisting, feeding on itself. His thoughts tangled, spiraling into something darker. Why was the scent still there? Why wouldn't it go away? It burrowed into him, latching onto something deep inside. Something he had always kept under control, buried beneath years of composure and restraint. But tonight it was rising. He clenched his jaw, his fingers curled around the stem of his glass. Maria kept talking, her voice smooth and unbothered, unaware of the storm unraveling inside him. She didn't notice how his gaze had changed, how his breathing had shifted. She didn't notice that something inside John had just snapped. What had begun as a celebration of love was unraveling into something unrecognizable, a slow, suffocating shift from warmth to unease. The woman he had vowed to spend his life with now felt unfamiliar. Her presence no longer a source of comfort, but of quiet, gnawing disturbance. Maria laughed softly, oblivious to the tension rising between them. But John's mind was elsewhere. His grip on the glass tightened, his fingers pressing so hard against the delicate stem that it threatened to snap. His smile, once effortless, once real, had faded into something hollow. The air between them grew heavier, thick with something unsaid. It wasn't visible, but it was there, hanging, waiting. The silence stretched, tightening around John like a vice. His thoughts twisted and darkened, spiraling into something he couldn't contain. And then, something broke. What happened next would change everything. Have you ever felt it? That moment when something shifts, when the person in front of you, the one you thought you knew, suddenly seems like a stranger? One tiny detail, one fleeting feeling, and nothing is ever the same. What do you think it was in this case? Let me know in the comments. John Mitchell had built his life on control. As a pastor, he was admired for his composure, his ability to guide others through hardship with unwavering patience. He was a man of faith, a man of principle, a man who never lost his temper. Until now, something inside him was unraveling, slowly, methodically, like a rope fraying under unbearable tension. It was as if an invisible hand was pulling at the deepest, most fragile threads of his restraint. It wasn't just the smell anymore. It was everything. The weight of the day, the exhaustion pressing in on him. The realization, sudden and violent, that something about Maria was different. Had it always been there, lurking beneath the surface? Had he simply failed to notice? Or had it changed tonight, right in front of him, when it was too late to turn back? His mind spun. His pulse pounded in his ears. Across the room, Maria was still smiling, still laughing. But to him, it sounded distant, like an echo from a place he no longer recognized. His grip on the champagne glass tightened. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface was no longer something he could control. It was consuming him, clouding his thoughts, twisting them into something darker. He had always prided himself on his restraint, on his ability to remain composed no matter the situation. But tonight, that control was slipping through his fingers like sand. The smell. It wasn't just an annoyance anymore, it was a trigger. Something about it lodged itself deep inside him, burrowing into his mind like a splinter he couldn't remove. What started as a minor irritation had become unbearable, morphing into something sharper, something more dangerous. His pulse quickened, his breathing shallow and uneven. He told himself to calm down, to let it go. It was just a smell, just a fleeting discomfort. But it was too late. The irritation was no longer just about that. It was everything. The quiet tensions that had existed long before tonight, the cracks in their so-called perfect union that he had ignored, the subtle moments that had never quite made sense. He had seen them, he had felt them, but he had chosen to look away. And now, in this moment, with the weight of the night pressing down on him, those cracks were splitting wide open, threatening to swallow him whole. Across from him, Maria took another sip of her drink, her lips curving into an easy, effortless smile. She had no idea what was happening. No idea how much had changed in just a few short minutes. The man sitting across from her, the man she had just sworn her life to, was no longer the same. John's breathing grew heavier, his chest rising and falling in quick, shallow bursts. She wasn't perfect. She never had been. The realization hit him with a force that left him unsteady. Everything he had built in his mind, the image of the flawless bride, the perfect future, it was crumbling before his eyes. And for what? Something so small, something so insignificant. And yet it was enough to make him see her differently, enough to make him question everything. The anger clawed its way up his spine, coiling around his throat like a vice. He felt it now, an overwhelming mix of rage, betrayal, and something far worse, disappointment. A deep, bone-deep disappointment that made his stomach churn. And then, without warning, it happened. His fingers clenched too hard around the delicate stem of the glass. A sharp snap echoed through the silence, the shards falling to the floor in a jagged mess. The sound was small, barely a whisper in the vast space of the room, but it was final, like something breaking inside him. Maria looked up, startled, but it was already too late. The storm was here, and there was no stopping it now. John's trembling hands hovered above the shattered glass, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Blood rushed to his head, his vision swimming as he fought to steady himself. But there was no rational thought left, only the raw, pulsing force of something he could no longer control. The composure he had prided himself on, the restraint that had defined him, had slipped away entirely. All that remained was the suffocating weight of frustration, helplessness, and an anger too vast to contain. His eyes locked onto Maria, still sitting with her back turned, slightly humming a soft tune, unaware of the storm building behind her. The rage inside him ignited. Without hesitation, he moved. It wasn't a dramatic outburst, not at first. No wild shouting, no sudden display of violence. Just a single decisive motion. Quick, instinctive, inevitable. His hands closed around her throat. Maria's body jerked in surprise, her fingers clawing at his wrists as she tried to break for root bone. But John didn't stop. He couldn't. The unbearable tension that had been suffocating him now had an outlet, and with every passing second, his grip only tightened. Her struggling slowed. The fight in her limbs began to fade. The room that had once been filled with laughter and warmth was now steeped in something cold, something final. And then, it was over. Her body slumped in his arms, the weight of her lifeless form pulling him back to reality. The silence was crushing. The sheets beneath them, once pristine, were now stained with the marks of what he had done. John stepped back, his chest rising and falling in uneven, ragged breaths. His hands trembled, reaching out slightly, as if he could undo what had just happened. But there was no undoing it, no going back. The realization came slowly, too slowly. Then the sirens. The flashing red and blue lights outside cast eerie shadows through the window, illuminating the wreckage of what had once been a perfect wedding night. The door burst open, officers flooding the room, weapons drawn. They saw her first. Maria, motionless, twisted unnaturally on the bed. The broken look of a man who had destroyed everything. That was all that remained. The evidence lay before them, blood soaking into the bed, staining the pillow, seeping into the once pristine sheets. The room, which had been filled with warmth and laughter just hours before, was now frozen in horror. The distant crackle of police radios filled the silence, a cruel reminder that there was no escape now. But the question lingered in the heavy air. Was it a moment of madness? A fleeting fracture in his mind that made him snap? Or had something darker always been there, buried beneath his carefully composed exterior, waiting for the right moment to emerge? Had this been inevitable? The shock of the crime rippled through the local police department. Officers moved methodically through the scene, their faces unreadable as they documented the devastation. Flashbulbs flickered, capturing every sickening detail. The twisted sheets, the splatters of blood, the lifeless body of Judge Maria Johnson sprawled across the mattress. But there was something wrong. John Mitchell, the man at the center of it all, was missing. His absence sent a wave of unease through the officers. Had he fled? Was he running from what he had done, fully aware of the weight of his crime? Or was there another explanation? One that neither the police nor the world were prepared to hear. Detectives spread out, combing the hotel and the surrounding streets, but the questions loomed heavier than the night itself. How could a man so calm, so composed, so revered, have unraveled in such a violent way? What had really happened in that room? The search didn't last long. A phone call came through, the dispatcher's voice cutting through the tension. John Mitchell had been found. He was wandering aimlessly along a quiet street not far from the hotel, his expression vacant, his steps slow and directionless. He didn't run, he didn't resist. When the officers approached, he merely stopped and looked at them, as if waking from a dream he couldn't remember. His clothes were stained, his hands trembled, but his voice was steady, and then he said something that sent a chill through the investigators. It wasn't what they thought, it wasn't murder, it was self-defense. Maria had attacked him. The story he told was one of fear, panic, a desperate need to protect himself. She came at me, I had no choice. She was going to hurt me. John's voice trembled, yet his words were steady, as if repeating them enough times would make them real. His version of the night was not what the police expected. He claimed Maria had turned violent, that the argument had escalated, and that something inside her had snapped. He had only reacted, only done what he had to do. But the room told a different story. There were no signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds on his body, no indication that Maria had attacked him in any way. The scene was eerily one-sided, silent sheets soaked in blood, a single act of violence with no trace of resistance. Yet John held firm. His hands twitched, his breath hitched in uneven gasps. His gaze darted between the officers, as if searching for an escape, as if the walls were closing in. His words lacked coherence, yet his conviction was unshaken. Was this a man unraveling under the weight of his own guilt? Or was there something far more disturbing beneath the surface? The detectives sifted through every piece of evidence. The crime scene photos, the forensic reports, testimonies from hotel staff. But nothing, not a single piece, corroborated John's version of events. There was no history of violence from Maria, no sign of a struggle, no wounds on his body to suggest self-defense. The more they dug, the clearer the truth became. This wasn't a reaction, it was an execution. But the inconsistencies in John's story ran deeper than just his shifting narrative. How had he left the room so quickly? Why hadn't he called for help? Why did he simply vanish into the night, walking away from the horror he had created? The evidence against him was overwhelming. But still, John clung to his story. Something happened, he insisted. Something made me do it. But what? As the investigation continued, a chilling realization took hold. This wasn't a single moment of madness. It wasn't a sudden lapse in judgment. It had been building for months, perhaps years. The police didn't stop at the crime scene. They went deeper, into the couple's past, into the unspoken moments of their relationship. And what they uncovered sent a chill through even the most hardened detectives. Their marriage had been fractured long before that night. Beneath the vows, beneath the smiles, Beneath the carefully curated image of a perfect union, there had been tension. Unmet expectations, buried resentments, the smell. The smell that had set him off, that had triggered the violence, had only been the final spark. The cracks had always been there, and now the truth was beginning to seep through them. The perfect couple, always seen smiling, always hand in hand, had been hiding something far more insidious. Beneath the polished image, beneath the carefully rehearsed affection, there had been fractures widening with each passing day. The arguments were frequent but silent, waged in stolen glances and words left unsaid. The disillusionment between them had grown like a rot, unnoticed until it was too late. Maria, brilliant, ambitious, relentless, had carved her path as a respected judge. Independence had always been her nature. But John, her husband, her pastor, the man who had built his life on faith, felt himself slipping further into irrelevance. The more Maria flourished, the more he withered. He disguised it well, buried the resentment beneath a mask of devotion, convinced himself that love meant endurance. But love had never been enough. John had spent a lifetime running from ghosts, a childhood marked by neglect, by distant parents and hollow reassurances, a string of failed relationships that left him with scars he refused to acknowledge. When he met Maria, he told himself she was the answer, the light that would finally drown out the shadows. But love doesn't erase wounds, it only exposes them. And John was bleeding. Investigators uncovered a marriage built on misaligned expectations. Maria thrived in control, in the order of her courtroom, in the weight of her authority. Long hours, hard decisions, a life dedicated to justice. John, in contrast, had always craved closeness, constant affirmation, the kind of love that made him feel necessary. But Maria didn't need him, not the way he needed her. And that realization festered, day after day, year after year, until the weight of it became unbearable. Then there was the smell, the detail that seemed so small, so insignificant. A scent, a trigger. To John, it became something far more than an irritation. It was a manifestation of every disappointment, every failure, every moment he had felt unseen. The frustration, the resentment, the disgust he had spent a lifetime suppressing came roaring to the surface. The smell wasn't just a smell, it was a symbol of his marriage's decay, of his own inadequacy, of everything he couldn't control. He hadn't reacted to a moment. He had reacted to a lifetime. The rage that erupted that night wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't a fleeting loss of composure. It was the inevitable collapse of a man who had been unraveling for far too long. A man who had mistaken silence for strength, endurance for devotion. Maria's murder shocked the nation. But the truth behind it, the truth of their marriage, was far darker than anyone could have imagined. And the trial that followed, it would reveal horrors even more twisted than the crime itself. The courtroom was suffocating with anticipation. Every seat was filled, cameras flashed, and the world watched as the trial of Pastor John Mitchell unfolded. A nation held its breath, torn between two narratives. Was this the desperate act of a man pushed beyond his breaking point? Or was it something far more calculated? A murder cold in its precision, hidden behind the mask of faith and devotion? The people who once revered him as a man of God now questioned everything. Could a man who preached love and redemption be capable of such brutality? The divide was stark. Those who believed his claims of self-defense, and those who saw nothing but a monster lurking beneath the surface. John's defense clung to the idea of a devoted husband who had simply snapped. They painted him as a man overwhelmed by pressure, drowning in the shadow of his wife's success, crumbling under the weight of unspoken pain. They insisted that Maria had attacked him first, that he had fought back only in fear, only in desperation. But the prosecution was ruthless. They ripped apart his story, exposing the cracks. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of a struggle, nothing to suggest Maria had lifted a hand against him. Instead, they laid bare a history of control, of anger left unchecked, of a man who had spent years nursing a wound he refused to acknowledge. And then came the letter. It was the turning point, the moment that silenced the entire courtroom. A document written by John months before Maria's death, a confession in ink. In it, he detailed his resentment, his frustration at Maria's success, the way her independence made him feel small, the way his own life had felt more like an afterthought in the shadow of her achievements. He wrote of their growing distance, his fear that he was losing control, not just of his marriage, but of himself. It was not the writing of a man afraid for his safety. It was the writing of a man who had been unraveling, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but rage. The truth was inescapable now. The question was no longer whether John had killed Maria. The question was how long he had been planning it. Was he ever truly a man of faith? Or had the mask just slipped, revealing what had been there all along? No matter what the verdict would be, one thing was certain. Pastor John Mitchell was no longer the man the world thought he was, and he never had been. The man who had once been hailed as a beacon of faith, a trusted pillar in his community, now stood as a grim symbol of something far darker, an embodiment of hypocrisy, far removed from the life he had once claimed to lead. As his trial drew to a close and the verdict was delivered, the air remained thick with questions that no one could answer. Was this a singular, uncontrollable act of violence? Or was there something far more sinister, hiding beneath the surface of the man they thought they knew? A man whose soul had been cloaked in darkness for far longer than anyone could have imagined. The public's perception of Pastor John Mitchell was forever shattered. They couldn't reconcile how someone so outwardly devoted, so committed to a life of faith, could be capable of committing such an unspeakable act. Were there deeper secrets buried in his past, festering for years, unseen fears, unresolved traumas that had never been addressed? Or had the weight of his insecurities, amplified by the relentless pressure of his marriage, finally pushed him to the brink? These questions remained unanswered, leaving an unsettling emptiness where once there had been answers. John Mitchell was convicted of murder. His life behind bars would forever be marked by the brutal truth of that night, a night that had shattered the lives of everyone it touched. But for Maria's family, the suffering never truly ended. They were left to carry the haunting memory of a woman brimming with promise, her future cruelly stolen in an instant. The unanswered questions surrounding her death would gnaw at them for years, a painful reminder of the life that could have been. This case serves as a chilling reminder that even the most seemingly perfect relationships can harbor terrifying secrets, and that the unresolved emotions, deep-seated insecurities, and unhealed wounds of the past can have catastrophic consequences. It's a reminder that the truth often lies hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to be exposed. What do you think? Was this truly a moment of madness, or was there something darker at play all along? Leave your thoughts below, and be sure to subscribe for more shocking, true crime stories. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. If you enjoyed this video, share it with your friends who love true crime. See you next time. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more disturbing, true crime stories. Leave your thoughts and theories in the comments below. Let us know what you think. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next video.